The cold midnight wind swept through the small town of Greystone as Lucas Stevens arrived at the abandoned station. The place was a relic from the past, forgotten by the townspeople, but now it had come alive again with rumors of something supernatural. The news had spread like wildfire. A train that had vanished 50 years ago had mysteriously reappeared without warning. And it wasn't just a story from superstitious locals. The train was really there, standing on the tracks as if it had never left. Gray smoke slowly drifted from the old locomotive, curling into the dark sky, as if being pulled by some invisible force. Lucas looked around, seeing the deserted station. The rusty sign still swayed in the wind, the high-pitched squeak the only thing disturbing the eerie silence. He was the only journalist at the scene, and the town had chosen to ignore what it couldn't explain. For Lucas, this was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. His career was in decline, and this story, if true, could finally put him back in the spotlight. With a flashlight in hand, he walked toward the train. The rusted metal reflected the faint glow of the moon, but strangely, the cars themselves seemed perfectly intact, as if they had just been built. The locomotive had an eerie beauty, like a time capsule that refused to show the wear of years. The door of the first car was slightly ajar, a dark abyss waiting inside. Something was wrong with this place, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. But he knew he had to enter. The wooden floor creaked under his feet as Lucas stepped cautiously inside. The air was immediately cold, biting at his skin. The smell of mold and abandonment filled the space, but the seats, the darkened lights, and the scattered luggage made it seem like the passengers had just left. Lucas glanced around, intrigued. There were no signs of life, just that strange silence, as if even the air had been trapped in time. As he moved down the narrow aisle, something made his skin crawl. He heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Lucas. The voice was distant, like an echo from another time. He stopped, trying to figure out where it was coming from, but the only thing he heard now was his own heart pounding in his chest. He was alone, or at least he wanted to believe that. In the third row of seats, Lucas noticed something odd. A brown envelope lay carefully placed on the seat. He leaned down and hesitantly picked it up, feeling the aged paper between his fingers. When he opened it, there was a small handwritten note, written in an old, shaky script. Only one sentence was written, "Only you can save what was lost." Lucas' mind raced with questions. Who wrote this? How did they know his name? He read the sentence over and over, but it made no sense. The train had been gone for 50 years, no one should have known he was coming, much less been waiting for him. But before he could think of a logical explanation, he heard another sound. This time, it was clearer, coming from the door at the end of the car. His heart racing, Lucas moved toward the sound, pushing open the door to the next car. A cold breeze brushed against his face as it opened. Inside, the seats were covered in dust, but something caught his eye. In the middle of the aisle lay an old suitcase, partially open, with clothes from another era spilling out. He crouched down to inspect the contents, and what he found made him freeze. Among the clothes was a train ticket dated April 4, 1964, the same year the train disappeared. Lucas couldn't believe it. That suitcase seemed to belong to someone who had been on the train the day it vanished. He felt a rush of adrenaline course through him. Something unexplainable was happening here, something he needed to understand, but the feeling that he was being watched was growing stronger. When he lifted his eyes, he noticed a shadow at the far end of the aisle, a faint figure that disappeared as soon as he blinked. The whisper came back, this time louder. Lucas, this time, he was sure it wasn't his imagination. The voice was there, inside the train, as if the very atmosphere was calling to him. He tried to ignore the growing fear inside him and walked deeper into the train. He knew he was getting involved in something beyond his comprehension, but there was no turning back now. Lucas moved deeper into the train, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the empty car as he tried to stay calm. He was here for a reason, to uncover what had really happened to this train. Yet, the letter in the envelope and the whisper of his name in the shadows disturbed him in a way he couldn't explain. The further he explored, the more he felt like he wasn't alone. Something, or someone, was watching his every move. The aisle seemed to stretch endlessly, and each car he passed revealed the same unsettling scene: passengers frozen in time. They sat in their seats, heads tilted, as if in a deep, eternal sleep. There were suitcases abandoned in the overhead compartments, some slightly open, revealing clothes and personal belongings from a bygone era. Lucas moved carefully, examining every detail. The train, like its passengers, was a time capsule, untouched for decades. As he passed through the rows, Lucas stopped abruptly at something that caught his eye. On one of the seats lay a small, worn leather diary. He approached and picked it up, carefully opening its fragile, yellowed pages. The diary belonged to a woman named Eleanor Harper. Her handwriting was neat, filled with detailed notes about her journey. Lucas flipped through the first few pages, which described Eleanor's excitement about boarding the train, a trip toward a mysterious destination she only referred to as the last stop. But as he read further, the tone of her words began to shift. Eleanor wrote about a growing sense of unease among the passengers, about an invisible presence that seemed to follow the train, and finally mentioned a figure she called the timekeeper. Eleanor seemed convinced that this timekeeper controlled the fate of the train and its passengers, and that the last stop wouldn't be what they expected. Lucas sat in one of the seats as he read Eleanor's final entries. They were fragmented, written in haste, as if she were afraid. Something is wrong. People are disappearing. The train is no longer on the right path. The timekeeper, he won't let us leave. This place isn't what it seems. Those words weighed heavily on Lucas' mind. The train had vanished 50 years ago, and Eleanor was describing something beyond his understanding. The timekeeper? What did that even mean? He knew he was dealing with something far beyond a simple disappearance. There was a force at play here, something that defied the reality he knew. As he reflected on the diary, the train seemed to vibrate lightly, as though an unseen current ran through the cars. Lucas quickly stood up, slipping the diary into his jacket. Looking outside through the dirty windows, he saw that the station's clock was still stuck at exactly midnight. No matter how long he had been inside the train, everything outside remained frozen in time. Lucas tried to recall if the clock had been working when he arrived, but he couldn't remember. The strange feeling that time had stopped the moment he stepped onto the platform was becoming stronger. When he turned his gaze back to the aisle, he saw the shadow again. This time, it was at the far end of the car, motionless, watching. Lucas' heart raced, and he took a step toward the figure. But as soon as he did, it vanished, like a mirage disappearing into the air. He was beginning to doubt his own sanity. The train, the diary, the frozen passengers, the shadows, it all felt like part of a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. But he knew he had to keep going, to understand what was really happening here. There was no turning back now. Passing through the door into the next car, Lucas found the same familiar scene: seats, abandoned suitcases, and unmoving passengers. But something in this car felt different. The air was heavier, almost oppressive. Upon closer inspection, he noticed a fine layer of dust covering the floor and seats, suggesting that no one had set foot in this car for a long time. Yet there were fresh tracks in the dust, as if someone had recently walked through. Following the tracks, Lucas reached the end of the car, where he saw an old suitcase lying on the floor, partially open, with clothes scattered around it. He crouched down to examine the contents, and among the clothes, a piece of paper caught his attention. It was a train ticket, dated April 4, 1964, the same day the train vanished. He held the ticket for a moment, trying to process what it meant. The whisper returned, this time clearer and closer. Lucas, he turned quickly, but the aisle was empty. The feeling of being watched was growing with every second. Now, there was no doubt that the train was somehow alive, and that he was caught in something much bigger than he could have imagined. Lucas was starting to feel overwhelmed. Each car he passed through felt heavier, as if the air was thickening, becoming more oppressive with every step. The shadows that seemed to follow him were always on the edge of his vision, never fully visible, but close enough to keep the tension rising in his chest. He knew he was getting closer to something, to some secret buried in the time and darkness of this train, but each step made it harder to stay composed. He crossed the door into the next car, immediately sensing a change in the atmosphere. The aisle ahead was bathed in a strange dimness, as if the light filtering through the windows was being swallowed by the shadows. Lucas paused for a moment, gripping his flashlight tighter, its beam trembling slightly as he forced himself to take the next step. As he moved forward, the silence became more oppressive. It was no longer the quiet of an abandoned train, it was something deeper, more unsettling. Lucas knew he wasn't alone. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to leave, but he kept moving. Eleanor's diary weighed heavily in his jacket, a constant reminder that he needed to know the truth, no matter how terrifying. When he reached the middle of the car, a low sound, almost a whisper, broke the silence. Lucas froze, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from, but it seemed to come from all directions at once. The timekeeper, the words were distant, but unnervingly clear. He stood still, trying to control his breathing, listening intently. This time, the sound felt closer, as if it was coming from within the car itself. Suddenly, a shadow moved in the corner of his eye. Too quick for him to make out, but real enough for him to know he wasn't imagining things. He swung the flashlight toward the shadow, but all he saw was the empty aisle, dusty seats, and frozen passengers. The whisper continued, now louder, more insistent. Lucas. Without thinking, he followed the shadow, feeling the floorboards creak beneath his feet. As he neared the door at the end of the car, he saw something that made his heart jump. A hooded figure, indistinct and tall, stood at the doorway leading to the next car. It seemed made of shadow, without a defined form, as if it were part of the train itself. Lucas felt a chill crawl down his spine. The figure didn't move, only watched him. For a moment, Lucas was frozen in place. He knew he should back away, but something inside him urged him to keep going. He took a hesitant step forward, and then, as if it were a mirage, the figure disappeared, dissolving into the air. The whisper, however, continued, now more insistent, as if it were coming from inside his own mind. Confused and disturbed, Lucas opened the door to the next car. The temperature seemed to drop even further, and the air grew heavier with the sense that something was about to happen. He knew he was being watched. The shadows, the whispers, the presence that had been following him since he entered the train, it all pointed to something far beyond his understanding. But he couldn't turn back now. He had come too far, and each step brought him closer to answers. With renewed determination, he walked down the aisle, eyes scanning for any movement, any sign. Eleanor's words echoed in his mind, the timekeeper. Who, or what, was this timekeeper? And why was he trapped on this train? As he neared the next door, Lucas felt a slight vibration in the floor, as if the train itself was alive, pulsing with some strange energy. He stopped, listening closely. The whisper had faded, and all that remained was the faint sound of his footsteps and his labored breathing. But then, without warning, the silence was broken by a louder, metallic creak coming from the front of the car. Lucas quickened his pace, heading for the door. When he opened it, a cold breeze hit his face, and beyond it, he found a small room that seemed out of place with the rest of the train. It was smaller and less decorated, as if it had been hidden away from those who shouldn't see it. In the center of the room sat an old wooden chair, and on it, a small black box with a locked clasp. He approached slowly, his heart racing. The box seemed out of place, as if it didn't belong to this time. Curious, Lucas knelt down and carefully touched the lock. It was cold to the touch, and for a moment, he hesitated, wondering if he should really open it. But before he could make a decision, a low, rumbling sound echoed through the room. Lucas turned abruptly and saw the shadow again, this time clearer, closer. It seemed to hover slightly above the ground, its presence heavy and threatening. Timekeeper. Lucas whispered to himself, never taking his eyes off the figure. The entity lingered for a few more seconds before slowly fading away, leaving Lucas with a deep sense of unease. He knew he was in danger, that he was dealing with something far beyond his understanding. The box, the train, the timekeeper, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle for which he still didn't have all the answers. But one thing was clear, he was being watched, and his presence on the train was no accident. The train felt colder now. Lucas was feeling more and more wrapped up in the heavy atmosphere that filled each car. But his determination grew with every step. Something was hidden here, buried in the time and shadows of this train, and he needed to uncover it. Yet, the sensation of being watched never left. Every shadow seemed to shift slightly around him, and the weight of the timekeeper's presence still hung over him. Leaving behind the small room and the locked box, Lucas pushed through another door, entering the next car. This one was even dustier and more abandoned than the others. The floor was covered with a fine layer of dust, and the air smelled ancient, like something long forgotten. But there was something different about this car. The tracks in the dust, like footprints, made him feel more alert. As he moved forward, his eyes caught sight of a suitcase lying in the middle of the aisle, partially open. The clothes inside, old and worn, were scattered around as if someone had fled in a hurry or simply disappeared. Lucas knelt beside the suitcase and began to sift through the contents. Among the yellowed clothes, he found a piece of paper that made him stop. It was a train ticket, dated April 4, 1964. The same day the train disappeared. He held the ticket for a moment, trying to process what it meant. How could a ticket from 50 years ago be here, perfectly preserved, as if it had been used just yesterday? The idea that time inside the train didn't follow the same rules as the outside world was beginning to take shape in his mind, and he knew the mystery was much bigger than he had ever imagined. That's when something else caught his eye. Among the clothes in the suitcase, he saw an envelope, folded with the seal already broken. Lucas picked it up and pulled out the letter inside, a handwritten farewell note. The words were a bit blurred, but he could make out enough to understand it was a letter from someone saying goodbye to their family, explaining that there was no way back. The tone was desperate, and the signature at the end made Lucas shudder. Eleanor Harper. The woman whose diary he had found earlier. His mind began connecting the dots quickly. Eleanor had been on this train, writing to her family about something terrible, something she knew would prevent her from returning. And now, he was following her footsteps, decades later, caught in the same cycle of mystery and fear that she had faced. Lucas pocketed the letter and ticket, feeling these clues would be essential to understanding what was happening. But as he stood up to move on, he heard something. A low sound, like a soft shuffling of feet, coming from the far end of the car. He snapped his head around, his flashlight shaking as it illuminated the aisle. Nothing. The aisle was empty, except for the shadows that seemed to grow denser around him. Still, the sound continued. It was faint, but unmistakable, like someone walking slowly, drawing closer. Lucas began backing up, his eyes locked on the far end of the car. The train seemed to be breathing, the walls vibrating with an energy he couldn't explain. Then he saw it, the faint figure of the timekeeper, standing again, watching. This time, it was closer, almost tangible, as if about to cross into the physical world. Lucas backed up until he bumped into one of the seats. He was trapped. The timekeeper didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, as if it was sucking all the air out of the car. Lucas knew he couldn't stay like this. He needed answers, but he also needed to get out of this train. Forcing himself to take a step, he reached for the door to the next car, keeping his eyes on the figure. Lucas' hand found the handle, and he yanked the door open, stepping through into the next car. But before leaving, he glanced back one last time. The timekeeper had vanished. There was nothing there now, just the empty, silent aisle. A chill ran down his spine. The presence was still there, but invisible, waiting for the right moment to reappear. In the next car, Lucas found something different. Instead of the usual rows of seats, there was a long wooden table in the center, covered in scattered papers and maps, as if someone had been trying to figure something out. He approached the table and examined the papers. They were diagrams of the train, detailed blueprints of each car, but marked with strange symbols and notes he couldn't understand. Scribbled in the margins were notes mentioning breakpoints and areas of time dilation. Once again, Eleanor Harper's name appeared in the notes. It seemed she had been trying to understand the nature of the train, as if she had discovered that time within the train was a shifting force, something that could be manipulated. Lucas felt a wave of understanding. Eleanor had been trying to break the cycle, to find a way out of this place trapped in time. But something had gone wrong. He flipped through more pages until he found what appeared to be a hand-drawn map, with a line leading to the last stop. Beside the map, there was another note from Eleanor: "The last stop isn't what we think. There will be no return." Those words echoed in his mind as he studied the map. He had to reach the last stop, wherever it was, if he wanted to understand what was really happening. The timekeeper, the distorted time, the frozen passengers, everything was connected to this final stop. But as Lucas gathered the papers and prepared to move on, the train trembled slightly, as if some unseen force was beginning to stir. He knew time was running out. The train was waking up, and he would have to race against it to uncover the truth before it was too late. Lucas' breath quickened as the train vibrated slightly beneath his feet, as though some unseen force was on the verge of fully manifesting. He knew he could no longer ignore the feeling that the train was alive, somehow controlling time and space at will. The clues he had found, Eleanor's notes, the map to the last stop, pointed to something much darker than a mere disappearance. But the closer he got, the more he felt like answers were near. He moved through another car, his steps echoing in the empty aisle. This time, there were no frozen passengers, only the oppressive silence and the growing sense that he was being watched. Every shadow seemed to have eyes, every sound felt amplified. The timekeeper was still out there, waiting for the right moment to appear again. As he opened the door to the next car, Lucas felt a wave of déjà vu, as if he had been here before. But something was different now. At the far end of the car, near a dusty window, he saw a mirror. It was old, the glass slightly clouded with age, but the dark wooden frame remained intact. The mirror seemed out of place, as if it didn't belong to the rest of the scene. Curious, Lucas approached slowly, feeling the weight of his own footsteps, his heart racing faster with each passing second. As he neared the mirror, something strange happened. The reflection staring back at him wasn't his own. Instead, he saw a younger version of himself, the way he had looked years ago, before all the disappointments and failures that shaped his current life. The figure in the mirror stood still, but the sadness in its eyes ran deep, as if it reflected every bad choice he'd ever made. Lucas took a step back, his body tense. This couldn't be real. But as he tried to look away, something about the reflection held him. He found himself confronted with memories he'd long tried to bury, moments of betrayal, selfish decisions made in the name of career success, people he had hurt along the way. The mirror seemed to reflect more than just his appearance, it was exposing his soul, revealing his flaws and regrets. The train vibrated again, and for a moment, Lucas felt a presence beside him. He quickly turned his head, but there was nothing there. Still, the sense that something was with him, just out of sight, made him shiver. He looked back at the mirror, and this time, the younger version of himself began to move. The reflection seemed hesitant but then lifted a hand, pointing directly at Lucas. It was in that moment that he understood. The train wasn't just a place lost in time. It was a kind of psychic prison, where souls were trapped in an endless cycle of guilt and regret. And he, Lucas, was being forced to confront his own sins, with the timekeeper as the judge. The timekeeper wasn't just some mythical figure, it was the manifestation of everything people tried to hide from themselves. An invisible overseer, determined to keep them there until they faced the truth. Lucas took a step back, fear washing over him. He didn't know if he could face what the train was showing him. His ruined career, his broken relationships. He had spent so much time running from these memories, blaming fate or other people for his failures, but now it was all laid bare, impossible to ignore. The train trembled again, and the reflection began to fade slowly. Lucas blinked, feeling disoriented. When he looked around, he realized the car had changed. The lights were dimmer, the air heavier, and the silence was absolute, as if the train itself was waiting for his reaction. "It's not real," he muttered to himself, trying to steady his mind. But deep down, he knew there was a truth here he couldn't deny. Everything he had seen, everything the train was showing him, had a purpose. He was being led to an inevitable confrontation with his past. Lucas backed away from the mirror, his body tense, and walked slowly toward the door leading to the next car. He knew he couldn't escape without facing what was happening, but he also knew he needed to understand more before making any decisions. Eleanor's notes had mentioned a last stop, and he was determined to reach it. But what would he find when the train finally stopped? And would he be ready for whatever it was? As he opened the door to the next car, Lucas was met with something unexpected. The environment here was completely different. The walls were covered in strange symbols, written in a language he couldn't decipher. In the center of the car was a table with several ancient-looking objects, carefully arranged as if they were part of a ritual. There were books, engraved stones, and a small hourglass that seemed to be the focal point. He approached the table, feeling the strange energy emanating from the objects. Examining the hourglass, he noticed the sand inside wasn't moving. It was as if time had stopped completely in that space. The timekeeper, everything he had seen so far pointed to this moment, to this invisible figure controlling time within the train. Suddenly, a sense of urgency overtook him. The train was taking him somewhere, and time was, in some way, both paused and running against him. He needed to find a way out before the cycle closed completely. Lucas pulled out Eleanor's diary again, searching for any clue that might help him. Her words echoed in his mind, "The last stop is not what we think. There will be no return." The meaning of those words was clear now. The train was taking everyone to a destination from which there was no escape, a place where time would become an eternal prison. He knew he was close to uncovering the truth. But was he ready to face it? Lucas was trapped in a whirlwind of thoughts as the train continued its silent journey toward the last stop. The motionless hourglass, the mysterious symbols, the mirror that revealed his darkest secrets, everything pointed to the fact that this train wasn't just a physical space but a manifestation of something greater, something tied to time, regret, and the guilt of each passenger. Eleanor's words in the diary were clear: "The timekeeper won't let us leave. This place is a prison with no escape." Lucas was beginning to understand what she meant. The last stop wasn't a regular destination. It was the end of the line for those who couldn't face their past mistakes, those who were trapped in cycles of guilt, unable to find redemption. And the train kept them locked in this cycle, somehow connected to the timekeeper, the hooded figure that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. He knew that he had to confront this entity, this invisible force that controlled the train and its passengers. But how? Where could he find it? Lucas felt as if every step was leading him deeper into a psychic maze, where time didn't follow normal rules and the past bled into the present. He was still haunted by the visions of his younger self, by the memories that the train had dredged up. As he opened the next door, he felt a shift in the air. The car ahead was different from the others. The light was dim, but there was a palpable sense that he was approaching something crucial. In the center of the car, he saw the hooded figure, the timekeeper. This time, it wasn't a fleeting glimpse. The timekeeper was there, waiting for him. Lucas paused for a moment, trying to steady his breathing. He knew this confrontation was inevitable, but that didn't make the moment any less terrifying. The figure seemed to hover slightly, its dark, indistinct form radiating an aura of power. Although it had no visible face, Lucas could feel the timekeeper's invisible eyes watching him. "You found us," the timekeeper's voice echoed through the car, low and empty, as if coming from all directions at once. "There always comes a moment when the cycle must close. You knew this, from the beginning." Lucas didn't respond right away. His hands shook slightly, but he forced himself to take a step toward the figure. "What are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse with tension. "Why are we trapped here?" The timekeeper tilted its head, a slow and deliberate movement. "I am time, Lucas. I am the weight you carry, the regret you try to bury. This train is more than a physical place. It's the reflection of your choices, of your failures. Everyone who boards this train brings something that binds them. And you are no different." Lucas took another step forward, trying to process what the timekeeper was saying. "So we're here because of our mistakes? We're trapped because we can't fix the past?" "Exactly," the figure replied. "But there is a difference between accepting your mistakes and living with them. This train is an opportunity for you to confront what you fear, what you try to forget. But most never manage to do that. And so, the cycle continues." Lucas felt a wave of despair wash over him. He knew the timekeeper was right. He had run from his mistakes for years, blaming fate or others for his failures. Now, everything was laid bare. He was faced with a choice, to confront what he had done, or remain trapped in this endless cycle. "And if I want to leave?" Lucas asked, his voice trembling. "What do I need to do to escape this place?" The timekeeper didn't respond immediately. A long silence followed, as if it were weighing Lucas' words. Finally, the figure leaned slightly forward, moving closer to him. "Not all sins can be forgiven, Lucas. Some choices can't be undone. But if you accept what you've done, if you confront your own darkness, maybe the cycle can be broken. The last stop is near. There, you will find what you seek, or what you fear." A shiver ran down Lucas' spine. The last stop. The final destination Eleanor had written about in her diary. He knew that, somehow, everything would come to a head there. But what would he find? And would he be ready to face whatever it was? The timekeeper began to move back, its words still echoing in the air. "The choice is yours, Lucas. But remember, time is unforgiving. It waits for no 1 inch." And then, like a shadow dissolving in the wind, the timekeeper disappeared. The car was silent once again, and Lucas stood there, alone, feeling the weight of the decision he had to make. He knew the last stop was approaching quickly, and there he would find the end of the cycle, one way or another. With a heavy heart, Lucas crossed through another door, feeling the train tremble slightly. Time was running out. Eleanor's diary still weighed in his pocket, and her words now made more sense than ever. There will be no return. The last stop would be his final judgment. The train was alive, and the timekeeper was the embodiment of everything he feared to face. But he had no choice now. Lucas knew he couldn't keep running from his mistakes. The cycle had to be broken, or he would be consumed by time, just like all the other passengers who had never found a way out. As the train slowed slightly, for the first time since boarding, Lucas saw something in the distance, through the foggy windows. A station. It was the last stop. The destination that would decide the future, or the end, of his journey. Lucas could feel the train slowing down as it approached the station. The last stop. The end of his journey. The car swayed gently, and the metallic groan of the wheels on the tracks echoed rhythmically, almost hypnotically. Through the fogged windows, he could make out the outline of the station ahead. But it wasn't an ordinary station. It looked old, with rusted and abandoned structures, shrouded in a thick mist. Everything was cloaked in an unnatural darkness. He knew this was the decisive moment, the place where everything would be revealed, where he would face the truth the train had been showing him since the start. The timekeeper had said he would have to confront his darkness, accept his failures. But Lucas still didn't know how he was supposed to do that, or whether he was really prepared for what was about to come. The train stopped with a soft jolt, and the silence that followed was deafening. No sounds came from outside, only Lucas' heavy breathing as he tried to process what was about to happen. Slowly, he rose to his feet, feeling the weight of the accumulated tension, and walked toward the door of the car. As he opened it, a cold wind hit him, sharp against his skin, as if the very air was charged with some ancient malevolence. Lucas stepped down onto the station platform, the wooden planks creaking beneath his feet. The space around him felt distorted, as if time itself had frozen in an endless loop. Ahead, a large, rusted iron door, partially ajar, led into what seemed to be the heart of the station. He knew he had to go through that door. Everything inside him screamed that the end of his journey was just beyond it. With slow, measured steps, he moved across the platform, the timekeeper's words echoing in his mind. Not all sins can be forgiven. Lucas knew that his choices had brought him here, but he still didn't fully understand what the train, or the timekeeper, expected him to do. He had spent his life running from his mistakes, trying to bury his regrets deep within his mind. But now, everything was laid bare. Passing through the iron door, Lucas entered a vast, empty hall, with high ceilings and walls covered in symbols he couldn't decipher. In the center of the room stood a figure, the timekeeper. But this time, the figure was different. The hood that had concealed its face was gone, revealing a pale, featureless face, like an unfinished mask. Its eyes, however, were deep and dark, like black holes that seemed to absorb all the light around them. "You've reached the end," the timekeeper's voice echoed through the hall, cold and hollow, as if coming from all directions. "This is where the cycle ends. The last stop. The moment of your choice." Lucas felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. He had been brought here to make a choice, but he still didn't fully understand what the timekeeper wanted from him. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The timekeeper tilted its head slightly, as if studying Lucas. "It's not what I want, Lucas. It's what you need. You've spent your life running, blaming others for your failures, but here, in this place, there is no more running. Only truth." Lucas felt a lump forming in his throat. The memories began flooding back. The failure of his career, the people he had abandoned, the betrayal he had committed to rise to the top. Everything was there, hovering over him like a shadow that had never truly left. You've seen the reflection of your choices, the timekeeper continued. The train showed you what you tried to forget. Now, the decision is yours. You can keep running, denying what you've done, or you can accept it. Confront your failures. But know this, if you choose to run, the cycle will continue. You'll remain trapped in this train, like all the others who have failed before you. Lucas felt a wave of despair wash over him. He had spent so much time trying to forget what he had done, trying to avoid confronting his past. Now, there was nowhere left to hide. But he also knew that accepting his failures would be the hardest thing he had ever done. Because accepting meant acknowledging that he had not only ruined his own life but had hurt others in the process. How do I do that? Lucas asked, his voice shaking. How can I fix what I've done? The timekeeper took a step forward, and the air around Lucas seemed to grow heavier. Not everything can be fixed. Some mistakes have no remedy. But you can make a choice. Accept what you've done. Live with it, instead of running from it. The cycle can be broken, but not without pain. Lucas closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the words. He knew the timekeeper was right. He couldn't go back and undo his betrayals, his selfish choices. But he could stop running. He could finally face what he had done and try to live with it, instead of hiding behind excuses. When he opened his eyes, the timekeeper was still there, watching, waiting for his answer. Lucas took a step forward, feeling a strange sense of resolution building inside him. I accept, he said, his voice steady, though his body trembled. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence was suffocating, and Lucas felt his heart pounding in his chest. Then, slowly, the timekeeper began to dissolve, as if fading into the air. The darkness surrounding the hall began to dissipate as well, and Lucas felt that something had changed. The train, the timekeeper, the cycle, it all seemed to be unraveling, as if his acceptance had broken the temporal prison that had held him captive. But then a question crossed his mind, was he truly free? Or was this just the beginning of another cycle? Lucas stood in the empty hall for what felt like an eternity. The timekeeper had vanished, dissolved into the darkness, and the silence that followed was almost oppressive. Despite the tension and uncertainty, something was different now. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere that had clung to the train since the beginning was starting to lift. The air felt lighter, less suffocating. For the first time since stepping onto the train, Lucas sensed that the invisible weight pressing down on him was beginning to ease. He looked around, trying to process what had just happened. The train had been a psychic prison, a cycle of regret and guilt, and the timekeeper had been the force that compelled each passenger to confront their own failures. Lucas had accepted his mistakes, acknowledged his wrongs, and the cycle appeared to have been broken. Yet, a lingering feeling of unease remained. He wasn't sure what came next. With slow steps, Lucas walked back to the platform. The train still sat there, unmoving and silent, like an old relic frozen in time. The mist around it began to fade, revealing more of the rusted, decaying structure of the station. Now that he could see more clearly, he realized that everything here looked like it had been abandoned for decades, as if time had stood still forever in this place. He climbed back into the train, his footsteps echoing on the wooden platform. As he entered the car, he noticed something had changed. The passengers, once frozen in time, were gone. The seats were empty, the luggage still scattered in the overhead compartments, but the figures that had once occupied those spaces had disappeared. It was as if the train had been emptied, as though the prison that held them had dissolved. Lucas moved through the cars, passing down the silent aisles, and found the hourglass he had seen before. This time, the sand inside was flowing again, moving at a steady pace. The time that had once been suspended was now back to its normal rhythm. The cycle that had been frozen appeared to be returning to its natural flow. Lucas held the hourglass for a moment, watching the sand trickle down, before placing it back in its spot. Time had resumed its course, but he wasn't sure what that meant for him. As he reached the last car, Lucas looked out the window and saw something he hadn't expected. A new station was appearing in the distance, bathed in soft, golden light. It wasn't like the eerie, shadowy station he had arrived at before. This one looked different, more real, more alive. He felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety as the train began moving again, slowly, as if it were returning to a normal path. Lucas sat down in one of the empty seats, watching the landscape shift outside as the train advanced along the tracks. He knew he was approaching somewhere, but he wasn't sure where. The last stop, was it truly the end? Or the beginning of something else? The train gradually slowed and came to a gentle halt at the new station. Lucas stood, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He descended the steps and stepped onto the platform. The air here was fresh, different from the oppressive atmosphere that had followed him since the beginning of the journey. There was something familiar about it, but also something new, as if he was stepping back into the real world, but changed somehow. He looked around, trying to understand what was happening. There were no timekeepers, no shadows, no echoes of whispers. Just the calm stillness of an ordinary station, with people moving in the distance, going about their lives. Lucas began to walk down the platform, feeling the solid ground beneath his feet, as if he had finally broken free from the prison that had held him captive. But as he moved away from the train, something made him stop. He turned and saw the car where he had been sitting. The windows were dark, and though the train was silent, it seemed to be waiting for something. It was a palpable reminder of what he had faced, a living memory of his confrontation with time and his own failures. He realized then that the choice he had made had consequences, and though he was free from the cycle, the train would still exist. He wasn't the only one burdened by the past, and other passengers would inevitably board that journey. The train would always be there, waiting for those who tried to escape time. Lucas turned his back on the train and walked toward the exit of the station. He didn't know what the future held for him, but one thing was certain: he had faced what he had been avoiding for so long. Accepting his mistakes, as painful as it had been, had set him free. He knew that life wouldn't be easy moving forward, that the ghosts of his past would still haunt him at times, but now he was prepared to live with them. As he walked away, the distant sound of a train whistle echoed in the air, and Lucas paused for a moment, looking toward the horizon. The midnight train was still out there, somewhere, carrying with it the mysteries of time and the souls who needed to face their truths. But Lucas knew that, this time, he wouldn't have to board it again. He smiled faintly, took a deep breath, and continued walking, leaving the train, the station, and the cycle he had finally broken behind him.